Welcome back. During the March quarter of this year, 87.7% of Australian properties resold for a profit. Only a minor portion of resales sold at a loss that can be attributed to COVID-19. That's according to CoreLogic. Eliza Owen is with me to detail more findings from CoreLogic's latest pain and gain report. Eliza, welcome to the show. Of the 87.7% that I mentioned, what's that measured from?
So we do an analysis of resale events, any sale result we've collected that has a historic or a past sale associated with it. And that way we can get a sense of the portion of properties that have resold for a profit or have resold for a loss during the March quarter. So over that time, we've looked at roughly 73,000 resale events. And so that's where we get the sense that there's, 87.7 of those had sold for a profit. It's a little bit lower than what we saw in the December quarter, where there were 88.7% of sales making a profit, but still a fairly high level of profitability, given that we saw these kind of strict lockdown measures coming in towards the end of the March quarter, which definitely slowed down sales activity.
I can imagine too, if someone maybe purchased a property 18 months ago and then turned around and resold it, it probably would be sold at somewhat of a loss. So I guess you've got to measure it on how long the people have owned that property as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the pain and gain analysis, we do all sorts of views around how long people have held properties for and what kind of result that would return for a resale. A lot of it does come back to the housing market cycle. As you say, if you buy at a high point and then 12 months down the track, the property market has gone into this downswing, you're more likely to resell at a loss. Typically, we see that profitable sales are held for a median hold period of 10 years. We also find that owner-occupiers are more likely to be holding on to their property for a bit longer because they're using the property to live in, whereas investors are more likely to make a quicker sort of turnaround on their sales and might be more willing to cop a loss on their sales because of the potential ability to claim those losses on money gained from property down the line.
Of course, we're looking here at comparisons, so the March quarter, which is really when COVID started to roll out, and comparing that to the latter part of 2019, I would assume, therefore, that as we get into the next quarter, the results are probably going to be more reflective of the impact of COVID.
I absolutely think that is the case. We did look at how loss-making sales kind of changed in response to the impact of COVID-19 and particularly things that kind of slowed down economic activity and transaction activity in property. What we found was that from mid-March, where we got the stricter social distancing measures in place, was that the portion of loss-making sales didn't really change, but I think it was kind of too soon to measure. At that point in time, transaction activity had just dropped off more generally. But I think looking at the June quarter, we might see more loss-making sales as people realize they might not be able to hold on to their properties. But I think because of the institutional intervention and the policies that are in place, it's not going to be a drastic blowout in the portion of loss-making sales. I think it'd probably just be an increase of a few percentage points perhaps over the next quarter.
What about in the variation between houses and units? Did you notice much difference there in the number of properties that were sold at a loss?
Yeah, so that's a pretty consistent pattern that we see historically. A pretty high portion of houses usually sell at a profit relative to units, and that was no different in the March quarter. We saw about 90.3% of houses selling at a profit compared to 80.2% in units. So there's quite a divergence there, and that divergence is particularly exacerbated in areas that, have a very high portion of investors. So say, inner city parts of Sydney and Melbourne, some of those mining regions where investors were more skewed towards unit stock. But generally the houses tend to have higher levels of profitability than units.
Were there any parts of Australia where, there wasn't a really dramatic increase in the number of loss-making property sales?
Yeah, so interestingly, there were two capital city regions that saw an increase in profitability, and that was Hobart and Sydney. So these two cities in the March quarter had seen a pretty steady level of profit-making sales. There are also parts of regional Australia that are kind of close to those city centres of Sydney and Melbourne as well. So Geelong is an example of where we typically see a very high portion of profitability. And parts of Tasmania as well that see that spillover of growth from Hobart. Having said that, I think that those regions are going to be subject to a bit of a shift in that dynamic because of COVID-19. So Hobart, for example, that has very high levels of profitability in its resales usually, might see a bit more structural damage from the fact that a lot of people working in hospitality, tourism and the arts have sort of lost their jobs and seen a big loss of income. And I think that's going to affect dynamics, particularly for that city that has a high level of exposure to that segment of the workforce.
Yeah, I know this report focuses on pain and gain or loss and profit, but it's interesting, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that COVID's had more of an impact on the number of sales as opposed to the number of loss-making sales. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. So what we saw when the lockdowns around border closures and economic activity came into place, the portion of loss-making sales over the quarter actually stayed quite steady, whereas I think the real impact we saw from COVID was just a fall off in transaction activity. And that's a sign that I guess if people are thinking they need to sell their property, they're not doing it right now because of that economic uncertainty. And again, that's really been helped by the banks offering this pause in mortgage repayments, as if to say, if you think you're going to have to sell at a loss right now, you don't need to right now. And they can sort of postpone that decision and see where the economy is at that stage.
I've been talking to Eliza Owen from CoreLogic, and the CoreLogic Pain and Gain report is a regular report that comes out, and we like to focus on it because it gives us a good indication about what's happening in the market. Eliza, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.